Let's ponder some more then on the ongoing protests in London over an action over climate change.
Demonstrators brought chaos to commuters in the city yesterday, closing down streets around Westminster as part of coordinated action taking place across the world.
Let's turn to the editor of the Environmental Politics Journal, who is Dr. Graham Hayes. Dr. Hayes, welcome to you. The ostensible aim of Extinction Rebellion is to bring forward the government's 2050 carbon neutral plan to 2025. There seems to be a consensus amongst most experts that that is wishful thinking, to put it lightly.
Yes, I think it's an ambitious target, certainly, but I think what they're trying to do more than that is trying to develop a change in the mindset of politics and climate change. And what they're saying is that the business as usual approach, as they call it, isn't good enough and isn't rapid enough. So what they're trying to do is to refocus public policy at making changes at speed and at that scale.
Let's take them at their word. Let's take them seriously. Let's assume that 2025 was a genuine objective. What sorts of sacrifices would the public have to make to bring that about?
Well, it's interesting that you talk in terms of sacrifice to begin with. I think perhaps one of the problems with the current debate is that it's all based around sacrifice and rather than being based around what needs to be done very, very quickly. And I think one has to look at what the British government has done recently, and I think one can look at the removal of coal from the electricity generation mix as being really, really important, but other issues to do with heat pumps, to do with transport, to do with the design of our cities, to do with the way that we consume, to do with the way that we buy food, etc., they've all been left somewhat to one side. So one of the criticisms that one could make, not just about the British government, but about the wider global politics of climate policy making, is that it's really gone for technological solutions, technological changes, which ordinary people don't really see. In fact, one of the things that we could talk about is how there's been a whole invisibilization of climate politics. And one of the things that Extinction Rebellion, I think, are doing is they're making it physical. They're making it material and real and making it mean something to, I think, what we could call ordinary people.
Ordinary people in France, I mean, just back to the semantics of what's been sacrificed or not. When we saw the Yellow Vest protests in France, I mean, okay, there was a smorgasbord of protests there. It wasn't just a single issue thing, but the thing that kindled the fire in the eyes of many was President Macron's plans to put a big green tax, as it was seen, on fuel, on vehicle fuel. And that's when public anger erupted. So there has to be, if, for instance, you are trying to push people away from diesel and petrol cars towards electric vehicles, there is going to be an element of compulsion.
I think to a certain extent we have to get used to the fact that if we are going to make rapid changes, then those changes are going to affect organise our daily lives, the way that we organise work, for instance. People are going to have to start thinking in a much more comprehensive way about what it means to work and about how we go about thinking through what the carbon cost of the ordinary everyday things that we do. But just to come back to your point about the Gilets jaunes in France, I think, you know, you've given one side of it, which is the imposition of taxes to do with fuel, but that was also a rebalancing of taxes. That was taking tax away from inheritance tax and loading it onto people who did not have alternatives, particularly in a very rural economy like France, where you've got medium cities which are highly dispersed, and people felt that they did not have the opportunity to be able to adapt. And one of the things about public policy is that we've got to think through what all of those challenges are. And there's no point us simply thinking about one technological substitution rather than another technological substitution. If all we're doing is having the same number of cars on the road and people working and living and doing all these other things in exactly the same way that we've done before, we have to imagine what the future is going to be in a much more thoughtful kind of way than simply thinking that nothing's going to change, or what does change is hidden from us and is out of sight under the bonnet of the car.
I cite the French example because Macron has the same idea as we Brits have to get to carbon neutral by 2050, but they do so in a sense from a very different jumping off point, which is that 75% of French domestic electricity and industrial electricity is produced by nuclear power stations. We don't have anything like that. So in a sense, they start with a great advantage that we don't have.
We do have that, and I think that's right. But I think that's perhaps slightly less relevant now than it might have been, say, 10, 15 years ago, partly because of the great success of removing coal by and large from the electricity generation in Britain. And it is true that we do have gas, and that the drive to develop fracking would be really problematic for that. But, we have made great strides forward, particularly in the generation of wind power. But I think, one of the things I would try to do is that we need to think beyond that now. We need to think beyond how we produce electricity, and we need to think about the other aspects of our daily lives. And I think one of the things that we could say about Extinction Rebellion is that what they're doing, I think, is giving people a sense of public agency, is allowing people to participate in a much wider debate, because lots of the debate about climate change has been about technology, has been about targets, has been about taxes, has been about accounting. It's not been about people taking decisions or people being able to say how they feel about what's going on around them. And so I think when we look at Extinction Rebellion, one of the things to think about is, why are so many people mobilized? Why are so many people giving up their time, going into the streets and physically being present and saying, this is how we feel about the changes in our lives and in the lives of future generations. And I think that's what's perhaps really valuable about it. And that's been left out of the wider policy discussion about how we should deal with climate change.
Graham Hayes, thanks very much.
Now, the government has just published its latest report on the state of Britain's no-deal preparation.